Yeah, hi, what's up? Okay, so yeah, today we're going to be talking about dreams. Dreams is a work, and this is the start of me recording and going into it. It wasn't actually written by him. He wrote Psychology and Alchemy and wrote about dreams in many different places, and this is a compilation that was put together by people who call themselves Jungians later on. By the way, so yeah, lo-fi. Very much not good quality video or audio, but that doesn't really bother me. And if it bothers you, you should maybe reconsider your life choices. I don't know why I'm doing video as well. Maybe because it feels more personal somehow than just audio. So this is going to be something for me to get used to as much as anything else, and then try and get rid of that light. Is there anything else I want to say? Yeah, I'm going to situate us. It's Thursday, the 5th of June, 2025. Yeah, double checking that I got the date right. And yeah, my name's Sam. I'm currently in the city of Amsterdam in a building full of art students. And if you want to have a look, I just decorated with all this, which is cool. And it feels like a good place to begin talking more about Jung. You could speed this up. Let's see. You're probably going to need a copy for this to be interesting to you. So you should be able to find this either a copy of Dreams or of Psychology and Alchemy, because what we're going to be talking about is part four of Dreams, which is called Individual Dream Symbolism in Relation to Alchemy. Um, I'm not going to give you images of text. You can get the text yourself. And I realize that's a requirement. Why is that important? It's not, but if you want to go through this analysis together, then it is important. So if you're proceeding, it's because that's something that's interesting to you, I guess. Yeah, it was originally a lecture in Zurich, 1936, translated as dream symbols of the process of individuation, which Jung revised and augmented. The essay and published it later in Psychology and Alchemy. Yeah, it was then published later in volume 12. The latter version is published here. Yeah, so going through this was for me like what the six means to me. So going through part four of Psychology and Alchemy was really a way into Jung for me, who's since become more important as a diagnostician and of both myself and this time, and a kind of role model, if you like. Although he's a pretty crazy person, so you want to be careful about taking Jung as a role model. At the start of it, I wrote at the start of like this section in the copy that I have. I'm just gonna like tell you what I've been writing through it. Herein lies one of the most cryptic and obscure analyses ever penned. The wealth of material brought to bear is staggering. To thus regard the phenomena as emergent, associative, and in essence symbolic, rather than following a clear logical train, proved exceedingly helpful. So what I mean by that is that studying this text is like studying a phenomena. It's not like doing a textual analysis of someone's logical argument. This is like there's something which is emerging through these pages, through Jung's analysis of a series of dreams, that I'm hoping to contribute to or shed light to. And so I'm talking here about the attitude with which to approach this endeavor, the intention. I had to reread it several times. Yeah, there was one time I remember I was yeah, traveling between Thailand and Indonesia in October 2024, and about 150 micrograms of LSD really helps to evoke a lot of the second half of this. Yeah, reading it alongside I think volume 16 of the collected works, Practice of Psychotherapy, especially Psychology of the Transference, and part two, um, Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious is fruitful reading them at the same time. Okay, we're beginning the first, this is like the, I don't know, whatever is it an epitaph? Epigraph? When people put a quote at the front. It's in Latin because of course it's in Latin. Um, Virgil. I'm not reading the Latin. Easy is the descent to Avernus. Night and day, the door of gloomy Dis stands open. But to recall thy steps and pass out into the upper air, pass out to the upper air. This is the task. This is the toil. Translated H.R. Fairclough. So, Avernus is capital A. Avernus is believed to be the entrance to the underworld in Virgil, who's an author. You need to know who Virgil is if you want to proceed. So believed to be the ascent to the underworld, the entrance to the underworld. It's also like in the world, it's also the name of a volcanic crater near Cumae in Italy. And within that crater is Lake Avernus. And according to tradition, all birds flying over that lake were destined to fall dead. Hence, its name was transferred to the Greek as Birdless Lake. And this is likely due to the toxic fumes that the mouths of the crater gave off into the atmosphere. So there is a real lake called Lake Avernus, and it really has a toxic effect on passing birds. At that place, there are also remains of temples to Apollo and Jupiter. And so this is obviously like suggestive, symbolic. Um, Jung is someone who basically went into the underworld and survived. And so, yeah, easy is the descent to Avernus night and day. The door of gloomy Dis stands open. Dis is the ruler of the underworld in Roman mythology and in the A- Aeneid by Virgil. Um, he's not a direct equivalent to Hades from the Greek. So he's ruler of the underworld in Roman mythology. He does not appear in person in Virgil. A good example of that is the Emperor in Star Wars: A New Hope, who does not appear in person. This is a yeah quality of an evil ruler archetype, not appearing directly. Yeah, in Virgil, the underworld is described as his domain, the domain of Dis. He has no direct Greek parallel. The quote is saying that it's easy to descend into the underworld, but harder to return and live. I'd also obviously mention Plato's cave and the symbolic ascent and descent. This is what it's going to be like. The image before the introduction, which you should be able to look at, seven virgins being transformed. We're going to go through the introduction today. That might do us. Am I going to read it to you? Yeah, I probably am. Um, it's going to be exhaustive. Introduction one, the material. This is paragraph 44. The symbols of the process of individuation that appear in dreams are images of an archetypal nature, which depict the centralizing process or the production of a new center of personality. The general idea of this process may be got from my essay Relations between the ego and the unconscious. For certain reasons mentioned there, I call this center the self, which should be understood as the totality of the psyche. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. The text is an analysis of a series of dreams and dream images that have to do with the mandala. Jung relates to the mandala as a symbol of what he calls the self. And if you imagine a circle with a dot in the center, this is sort of the most basic form of a mandala. And the self, he's saying that the self is symbolized by both the center, the dot at the center of that circle, and the circumference of the circle. It's the self is both. Mm. The symbols now under consideration are not concerned with the manifold stages and transformations of the individuation process, but with the images that refer directly and exclusively to the new center as it comes into consciousness. That's a pretty important statement for him to make. So we're not talking about the actual process of individuation, which is like personality development in the second half of life in for Jung. We're talking about the symbols referring to the new center of consciousness, the self, as it emerges into consciousness. He says these images belong to a definite category, which I call, which I Jung call mandala symbolism. In The Secret of the Golden Flower, published in collaboration with Richard Wilhelm, I have described this symbolism in some detail. In the present study, I should like to put before you an individual series of such symbols in chronological order. The material consists of over 1,000 dreams and visual impressions, coming from a young man of excellent scientific education. For the purposes of this study, I've worked on the first 400 dreams and visions, which covered a period of nearly 10 months. In order to avoid all personal influence, I asked one of my pupils, a woman doctor who's then a beginner, to undertake the observation of the process. This went on for 5 months. So you should already know of The Secret of the Golden Flower as like a key text introduced to Jung by Wilhelm, the author of the I Ching, the translation of the I Ching into English, as the person who really introduced Jung to alchemy. That's not actually the case. He definitely knew of alchemy long beforehand, but certainly after studying The Secret of the Golden Flower, that he went off into alchemy, and he's describing how he already described mandala symbolism in some detail there. What's unique about this contribution is that it's an individual series of such symbols, mandala symbols, presented in chronological order. So there's something about the individual quality of what's being presented here that feels meaningful to Jung. He's claiming to have avoided personal influence by asking one of his colleagues to have undertaken the analysis. This individual material consists of over 1,000 dreams and visual impressions, of which only 400 he used in the analysis, which covered a period of nearly 10 months. Imagine a 10-month period of your life where more than 400 dreams and images about mandalas showed up through your mind. Like this is I wonder who this person was. Yeah. The dreamer then continued his observations alone for 3 months. Except for a short interview at the very beginning, before the commencement of the observation, I did not see the dreamer at all during the first 8 months. Thus, it happened that 355 of the dreams were dreamed away from any personal contact with myself. Only the last 45 occurred under my observation. No with interpretations worth mentioning were then attempted because the dreamer, owing to his excellent scientific training and ability, did not require any assistance. Hence, conditions were really ideal for unprejudiced observation and recording. That's all not really necessary. First of all, then, I shall present extracts from the 22 initial dreams in order to show how the mandala symbolism makes a very early appearance and is embedded in the rest of the dream material. Later on, I shall pick out in chronological order the dreams that refer specifically to the mandala. So Jung is like extracting and from the series of dreams and basically drawing on the material that he sees fit to draw upon. Mandala, the footnote, mandala is a Sanskrit term meaning circle and also magic circle. Its symbolism includes, but not limited to, concentrically arranged figures, round or square patterns with a center and radial or spherical arrangements. Yeah, with few exceptions, all the dreams have been abbreviated, either by extracting the part that carries the main thought or by condensing the whole text to essentials. This simplifying procedure has not only curtailed their length, but also removed personal illusions and complications, including Jung's, as was necessary for reasons of discretion. Despite this somewhat doubtful interference, I have, to the best of my knowledge and scrupulosity, avoided any arbitrary distortions of meaning. Yeah, so like already we can like we're obviously we're going to be analyzing Jung at the same time as going through this series, and we can see how yeah, what I'm claiming here is that Jung is ashamed, afraid, and guilty of both hiding and what he hid. So yeah, the simplifying procedure has not only curtailed their length, but also removed personal illusions and complications, as was necessary for reasons of discretion. The first hypothesis is that that's not just about the dreamer, but also about Jung himself, and that by selecting specific images, he's essentially able to protect the integrity of his own ego, which that's fine, nothing wrong with that. But he's making an admission. I'll say more about what I mean there later. Yeah, he then says, the same considerations had also to apply to my own interpretation, so that certain passages in the dreams may appear to have been overlooked. Had I not made this sacrifice and kept the material absolutely complete, I should not have been in a position to publish this series, which in my opinion could hardly be surpassed in intelligence, clarity, and consistency. It therefore gives me great pleasure to express my sincere gratitude here and now to the author for the service he's rendered to science. He's essentially asked himself for permission. Like there's a certain degree or level of exposure of his own internal process that he would be willing to make. Um, and he's found the right balance that enables him to present his own material just as much as the dream material in the form of the text. He's saying that like if he had kept the material absolutely complete and not hidden anything, then he wouldn't have felt good enough about it to publish it. It would have been too exposing. And so what's present strikes the balance of revealing to the astute reader, but also preserving the integrity of Jung's ego. Um, which I'm going to claim that he calls the unconscious in the text. And I'll substantiate that more later on as well. So basically, the unconscious is going to be speaking to us through Jung, and Jung's task was to allow himself to share the material that came through himself while also preserving the integrity of his own psyche, which is difficult. And that means that there are certain withholdings that are that he asks of himself in order to be able to share the rest of the material. And he has then a range of emotions about that. Um, both, yeah, there's this sort of fear, guilt, shame about the fact of hiding parts, and also about the parts that are hidden. There's also pride, obviously, and sort of success, and like, yeah, I did it, and that's cool. Okay, that's the substance of the first section, which is called the material. This is in the introduction, and the second part of the introduction is about the method. We're on page 117. In my writings and lectures, I've always insisted that we must give up all preconceived opinions when it comes to the analysis and interpretation of the objective psyche, in other words, the unconscious. We do not yet possess a general theory of dreams that would enable us to use a deductive method with impunity, any more than we possess a general theory of consciousness from which we can draw deductive conclusions. The manifestations of the subjective psyche or consciousness can be predicted to only the smallest degree, and there is no theoretical argument to prove beyond doubt that any causal connection necessarily exists between them. On the contrary, we have to reckon with a high percentage of arbitrariness and chance in the complex actions and reactions of the conscious mind. Similarly, there is no empirical, still less a theoretical reason to assume that the same does not apply to the manifestations of the unconscious. The latter are just as manifold, unpredictable, and arbitrary as the former, and must therefore be subjected to as many different ways of approach. In the case of conscious utterances, we're in the fortunate position of being directly addressed and presented with a content whose purpose we can recognize. But with unconscious manifestations, there's no directed or adapted language in our sense of the word. There is merely a psychic phenomenon that would appear to have only the loosest connections with conscious contents. In order to buy into this, you kind of have to buy into the distinction between conscious and unconscious, which is obviously foundational for Jung. As the discoverer, what I'm going to argue here is that as a discoverer of, let's say, the unconscious, Freud aside, there's a way that Jung identifies himself with the unconscious, which is going to become important. He's saying, like, since we don't have a general theory of dream, we don't have a deductive method. This makes his own interpretation of the following series of dreams vulnerable or subject to revision, which means, like, what he's saying is that it's not helpful to be a Jungian in what follows. It's not helpful to regard Jung as the authority. It's important to strike a balance between listening with humility to what Jung has to say and also offering our own interpretation. Anything else on here? Yeah. When he says, on the contrary, we have to reckon with a high percentage of arbitrariness and chance in the complex actions and reactions of the conscious mind. We have to have faith that the astute reader can see through the more conscious intentions that are present to share specific material and look through to the level of insight or understanding. So in order to proceed fruitfully, Jung's sort of asking that the reader have discernment. And this applies to the manifestations of the conscious mind just as much as to the manifestations of the unconscious mind. So there's a way that we're being addressed sort of ego to ego by, for example, at the level of being addressed ego to ego, one example is that Jung's ego is addressing the ego of the reader. For example, my ego. Um, we can expand it by saying that like I'm also addressing you in an ego to ego level. By invoking the concept of the unconscious, Jung is pointing to the phenomenon of the transference and saying that there's a way that, quote unquote, the unconscious is communicating to the unconscious in us and to the ego in us. And that by extension, obviously, the same thing is happening, although I can't see how the unconscious is communicating to you through me. That's kind of how it works. Page 118. If the expressions of the conscious mind are incomprehensible, we can always ask what they mean. But the objective psyche is something alien even to the conscious mind, through which is through which it expresses itself. Yeah, that's so this is to me like clear evidence that like there's there is a different level of communication that's going on in the text. There's a so I'm communicating something to you through myself, which is alien to me, the conscious ego, just as Jung is um, communicating something to us from an objective level of more objective rather than subjective level of the psyche, which is alien to him, his own consciousness. This is also the first place to mention that in his invocation of the objective psyche, um, he sees, as an empiricist, Jung sees the unconscious as more objective than the subjective ego, let's say. And so um, there's a way that Jung regards the unconscious with a scientific attitude. Um, what I'm going to argue later on, which is first mentioned here, is that the objective psyche or the unconscious is also a partial self-conception on Jung's part, meaning that his identity is tied up in his attachment to objectivity. This is not necessarily a criticism; it's an observation. So Jung identifies as a psychologist, as a psychiatrist, and as an objective scientist. He also identifies with it as sort of the discoverer of the unconscious, and it's not like when he says that the unconscious is speaking to us, he's also saying that he, Jung, is speaking to us. That's going to be substantiated more later on. Yeah, so in terms of the attitude, he says, this is still page 118. We are therefore, yeah, he says, but the objective psyche is something alien even to the conscious mind through which it expresses itself. We're therefore obliged to adopt the method we would use in deciphering a fragmentary text or one containing unknown words. We examine the context. The meaning of the unknown word may become evident when we compare a series of passages in which it occurs. The psychological context of dream contents consists in the web of associations in which the dream is naturally embedded. Yeah, so this is exactly what I've been doing, which is what we're deciphering here is not just the meaning of the dreams as Jung sees it, but we're also analyzing or deciphering Jung's own interpretation of those dreams. So there's a couple of different layers of analysis which are going on. And in order to understand the meanings of Jung's interpretation, we have to understand who he is and the context, the life, the identity into which his interpretations are embedded. That would involve, like, for example, reading the rest of the collected works, understanding more about who Jung is. Like, if you don't know some things about Jung, it will help you to find him out. But maybe that's why we're here together. Theoretically, we can never know anything in advance about this web of associations, but in practice, it's sometimes possible, granted long enough experience. Even so, careful analysis will never rely too much on technical rules. The danger of deception and suggestion is too great. In the analysis of isolated dreams, above all, this kind of knowing in advance and making assumptions on the grounds of practical expectation or general probability is positively wrong. It should therefore be an absolute rule to assume that every dream and every part of a dream is unknown at the outset, and to attempt an interpretation only after carefully taking up the context. Yeah, I mean, to me, this is like so clear. This is so obvious what he's saying. It's like if we go in blindly and assume that Jung has correctly interpreted this series of dreams, we would be missing the point of this whole thing. It's an unknown phenomenon which we're encountering, and we need to do so without falling back on rules, but simply by relying on our own discernment, our own judgment. Careful analysis will never rely too much on technical rules. Tao 15 is relevant in this context. We can then apply the meaning we've thus discovered to the text of the dream itself and see whether this yields a fluent reading, or rather, whether a satisfying meaning emerges. But in no circumstances may we anticipate that this meaning will fit in with any of our subjective expectations, for quite possibly, indeed very frequently, the dream is saying something surprisingly different from what we would expect. As a matter of fact, if the meaning we find in the dream happens to coincide with our expectations, it's a reason for suspicion. But as a rule, the standpoint of the unconscious is complementary or compensatory to consciousness, and thus unexpectedly different. I would not deny the possibility of parallel dreams, i.e., dreams whose meaning coincides with or supports the conscious attitude, but in my experience at least, these are rather rare. I don't think I have a whole lot to say about that, just to say that, yeah, it's like what the dreams mean to Jung is by no means what the dreams mean. Like what they mean to us and what his analysis now means to us in our context, um, can be completely different. And so what this is kind of saying is that if our own interpretations fit in too closely with Jung's interpretations, this is actually a reason to be suspicious of them. At least that's one thing that it's saying. It also is possible to see from here that it's not just the series of dreams that is saying something quite different than we might expect. It's also the whole phenomenon of this text, which is saying something quite different than we would expect, including but not limited to the layer of analysis which belongs to Jung. Still page 118. Now, the method I adopt in the present study seems to run directly counter to this basic principle of dream interpretation. It looks as if the dreams were being interpreted without the least regard for the context. And in fact, I've not taken up the context at all, seeing that the dreams in this series were not dreamed, as mentioned above, under my observation. I proceed rather as if I had had the dreams myself, and were therefore in a position to supply the context. This incredibly important little passage. Jung himself is the context of his interpretation. In this context, the concept of context is quite similar to Heidegger's thrownness, meaning that we're thrown into our identities, our lives, our time of being alive, and it's all of that which we bring to bear on any analysis that we perform. Um, yeah, Jung is proceeding as if the dreams that come through this young man were had as if they were had by him, as if they were his own dreams. There's another image. A maternal figure presiding over the goddesses of fate. These images obviously also have a meaning, but it's a little too obscure to go into right here. Yeah, sorry, page 119. This procedure, if applied to isolated dreams of someone unknown to me personally, would indeed be a gross technical blunder. But here we're not dealing with isolated dreams. They form a coherent series in the course of which the meaning gradually unfolds more or less of its own accord. The series is the context which the dreamer himself supplies. It's italicized in Jung. So if you try to interpret the meaning of an isolated dream, this is very risky and fraught because the power of suggestion and deception is too great. But if you deal with a series of dreams, then their meaning can unfold of itself, organically, naturally. And so what this means is that each of the dreams in the series is interpreted in the context of the other dreams. And as for Jung, it means that every interpretation of a dream that Jung offers is present within the context of his other interpretations of the other dreams, which form their own sequence, form their own series in exactly the same way. Mm. He says, this is page 120 now. It is as if not one text, but many lay before us, throwing light from all sides on the unknown terms, so that a reading of all the texts is sufficient to elucidate the difficult passages in each individual one. So I mean, should be obvious by now, but it's not just a series of dreams that we're reading, it's also the series of Jung's interpretations that we're reading. This is a different kind of text which is present in this phenomenon, a different layer, if you like. Um, it's also the case that Jung's interpretations reveal Jung himself, meaning that his interpretations can serve as a portal to the rest of his works, the rest of who he is, meaning it's as if the rest of his works were present in this analysis. It's also, if you read that sentence carefully, it is as if not one text but many lay before us. This raises the question, who? Who who is reading before us? Who is the us? Who indeed is dreaming? Yeah, so that a reading of all the texts is sufficient to elucidate the difficult passages in each individual one. Moreover, in the third chapter, we're concerned with the definite archetype, the mandala, that's long been known to us from other sources, and this considerably facilitates the interpretation. Of course, the interpretation of each individual passage is bound to be largely conjecture, but the series as a whole gives us all the clues we need to correct any possible errors from in the preceding passages. Blah blah blah. Still page 120. It goes without saying that while the dreamer was under the observation of my pupil, he knew nothing of these interpretations and was therefore quite unprejudiced by anybody else's opinion. Moreover, I hold the view based on wide experience that the possibility and danger of prejudgment are exaggerated. Experience shows that the objective psyche is independent in the highest degree, meaning the unconscious. Were it not so, it could not carry out its most characteristic function, the compensation of the conscious mind. He's talking about the autonomy of the unconscious and its relative resistance to influence or suggestion. The conscious mind allows itself to be trained like a parrot, but the unconscious does not, which is why St. Augustine thanked God for not making him responsible for his dreams. The unconscious is an autonomous psychic entity. What we call the unconscious is an autonomous psychic entity. Any efforts to drill it are only apparently successful and moreover are harmful to consciousness. It is and remains beyond the reach of subjective arbitrary control. in a realm where nature and her secrets can be neither improved upon nor perverted, where we can listen but may not meddle. The unconscious is an autonomous psychic entity. He repeats this again and again throughout the collective works. So something is speaking through Jung to us, something he calls the unconscious. It's not something that we can control or direct. Um, and indeed, if we do, it's harmful to us. It's beyond our control. It lies in a realm where nature and her secrets can neither be improved upon nor perverted, and where we can listen, but where we may not meddle. It is and remains beyond the reach of subjective arbitrary control. This is also a confession. This is Jung saying that he wasn't really able to control or direct this phenomena within himself, and he allows it to speak itself through him and sort of gets out of the way. There's an image, image number 7, the Ouroboros is symbol of the Aeon with moon and sun. It looks like a rooster as well. That's an important one. So there's then the 8th image, the Anima Mundi, the world soul, guide of mankind, herself guided by God. Um, so the Ouroboros, symbol of the Aeon, is kind of like this, yeah, this primordial chaos or realm beyond chaos and order, which is chaotic, murky, mysterious. It's from that place that the unconscious speaks to us. And yeah, I'm going to keep referring back to the world soul, anima mundi, at different points throughout this. The last thing here is that it's probably the main important part of what we're doing in this introduction, which is to offer some keys, the keys that I arrived at to help interpret the preceding whatever follows. And so these are keys to interpreting Jung, just as much as the dreams. There's 4 of them. The first one is that the first one I've written, refer dreamer as the reader. So Jung talks about the dreamer in this series of interpretations. And what Jung means is the dreamer of the series of dream images which he presents. But there's a way of understanding the meaning of dreamer to that it actually refers to whoever is reading. Um, this also another way to say so refer dreamer as the reader also means the hero or the subjective present consciousness. It's whoever's here. The whoever's here is can also be referred to by the term dreamer, is my claim. Um, and that's included but not limited to Jung himself. That's explored more in key 3. Key number 2, meanwhile, is we can refer unconscious as Jung, as a self-reference. So evidence for that self-association is ample in this and his other works. You could see my copies of Practice of Psychotherapy and 4 Archetypes. I'm not sure whether to what degree it's an unconscious self-reference. So Jung may know of his own personal association with the unconscious as himself. So my claim here is that like by referring to the unconscious, Jung is unconsciously referring to himself. The third key is a stronger claim on what I made in the first key. The first key was that dreamer can be referred to as the reader or whoever's here. But the dreamer can also refer to Jung. So you can go back to page 119, where he quote, I proceed rather as if I had had the dreams myself. as if I had had the dreams myself. So this is a clear, uh, this is not, I'm not making this up. This should be obvious, is that um, the dreamer can also be referred to as Jung himself. We can also regard Jung as the one who has had the dreams. Um, if where that's the case, where we understand the dreamer to be Jung, then the unconscious can be understood as something coming through Jung. So where there's a way that Jung's ego can identify as the dreamer, in which case the unconscious is what is unconscious through him, which is not his ego. Um, but he also at times identifies with the unconscious. So it's autonomous, but also partially facilitated by him. He allows it to speak through him. Um, the fourth key and fourth and last key. Yeah, once the Jungian quote, once the Jungian account is repaired, after about page 212, then all interpretations are caught up in the one process of transformation described in the dreams. What I'm saying here is that up through the following pages, we're on page 121, and we're going to go to about page 212. In reference to Jung's interpretation and the difference between what's actually going on in the dreams and how Jung interprets those dreams. But after that point in the text, all the different interpretations, including mine, Jung's, whoever else's, they get wrapped up into one process, the process of transformation described in the dreams. After that point, the dreamer can then be referred to as collective humanity, is my claim, where the magnum opus, the work, is then to individuate the soul of all the world, the anima mundi. So my claim there is that individuation refers to not just the development of an individual person, what we call, like for example, Sam or anyone else, but there is the process of individuation can also refer to the development of the individual quality of the whole species. Dreamer can then be referred as collective humanity, um, where the task is then to individuate the soul of all the world, not just of one person. And we're going to go in later on into the risks and differences between individual development and collective development, because clearly they have an opponent processing relationship, and it's not as simple as saying, oh, we actually have to collectively individuate the world soul instead of developing individually. It's not that simple. And I think that's where we're going to stop for now. Using those four keys, it's basically possible to um, get into my analysis, which follows on, but that's going to be at a different time because this is taxed your attention long enough. Next time, starting from page 121, we're going to go into the initial dreams. Bye.